The ocean that day seemed unusually calm, one of those deceptive, almost treacherous silences that appear only before a storm or before something far more serious. Heavy clouds dragged slowly across the sky, with pale rays of sunlight slipping through them and gliding over the hull of the giant that stood 100 miles off the coast. USS Gerald R. Ford, the newest aircraft carrier in the U.S. Navy, towered above the water like a city of steel, like a living machine in which every bolt held fear, hope, strength, and the responsibility of 5,000 future souls. Test engineer Alexei Kramer stood on the upper deck, almost spellbound. He had long since stopped being easily impressed, but today was different. The air seemed to vibrate, pulled taut like a string, and every breath carried the sense that something was about to fall from the sky and strike them. Even the steel deck felt colder than usual. He ran his hand along the railing, trying not to show the crew that he too felt a faint chill, a strange blend of awe, respect, and unease. These trials were set to be the harshest of his career. The first of 3 underwater explosions, 40,000 pounds of high-energy explosives, nearly 20 tons, was already primed. Somewhere beneath their feet, deep in the ocean's darkness where no human eye ever reaches, lay a charge capable of reducing a small ship to twisted scrap. And Ford's task was simple: survive it. "Are you nervous again, Alex?" asked Captain Travis Reynolds, a tall man with tired but resolute eyes. "Not nervous," Alexei lied, not even bothering to hide a faint smile. "Just thinking. Thinking about how hard it's going to shake us. Thinking that all of this goes beyond human comprehension. We build a monster and then try to break it ourselves." The captain chuckled quietly, the laugh of a man who had seen sailors at their best and at their worst for many years. "We're not trying to break it," he said softly. "We're trying to prove it won't fail us." A gust of wind swept over the deck, carrying the scent of salt and something else, something sharp like ozone before lightning. Officers exchanged brief confirmations. A warning tone echoed through the ship's internal speakers. And now came that moment when the world slows down and your heartbeat becomes louder than your breathing. "All hands, stand by for shock wave." The voice over the loudspeaker was calm, almost indifferent, as if announcing a routine maneuver. But everyone on board understood. This was no drill. Alexei felt his muscles tighten on their own. He sat down in a deck-mounted chair, snapped the harness into place, and glanced at Travis, who remained standing as if determined to shield the ship with his own body. In that instant, they both knew fear existed, and that was normal, but it had to be buried deep. A brief countdown crackled through the speakers like a shot splitting the air. 3, 2, 1. The sound that followed could not be called an explosion. It was something older, more primal, a roar that made it feel as though the ocean itself shuddered. Within seconds, a massive column of water surged skyward. As far as the eye could see, it grew like a living monster, tearing the sky into shreds. And then the shockwave struck the ship. The steel leviathan trembled. Not just a tremble, it shuddered with its 100,000-ton weight. Alexei felt the vibration pass through his chair, through his skin, through his bones. For a fleeting moment, it seemed as if everything around him tilted, as if the carrier had become fragile, but it held. When the shaking subsided, silence fell. Each person felt a strange surge rise inside them, exhilaration, adrenaline, fear, and pride all at once. The captain exhaled slowly and said, "And that was only the first one." They exchanged glances, and in those looks were surprise, unease, and a strange, almost terrifying admiration for the power of what they had created. Yet at that moment, no one knew that a far harsher trial awaited them, one greater than any explosion in the ocean's depths, a test not just for the ship, but for every one of them. After the first explosion rolled across the carrier's hull in a heavy, muffled wave, as if an enormous oceanic hand had struck the steel giant, an almost palpable silence settled within the ship.
It was so dense that it felt as though even the bolts were trembling under the tension. Every person on board, from the youngest sailors to the captain, understood that the real test had only begun, and that the ship, having withstood the first strike, now had to prove its resilience again and again, until the sea itself acknowledged that it faced a machine worthy of traversing its vast expanse. Alexei walked down the long corridor of the lower decks, and the deeper he went, the more he could feel a low hum resonating from the ship's working systems, as though the vessel were speaking to him, explaining that there was no room for weakness in its steel body, that every pipe, every cable, every rivet was undergoing the same trial as he, a man who knew the theory but had never before heard the metal sing after a real underwater detonation. Crew members passed him along the way, their faces serious, focused, but in every glance was the unique tension that arises when a person realizes they are part of history, not a fairy tale, but the kind later recorded in the fleet archives, where it is noted that the ship withstood the blow, yet not a word is written about the emotions of those standing inside. When Alexei entered the power systems compartment, he was immediately struck by an almost unnatural vitality. The machines were running slightly louder than usual, panels vibrating less than expected. The air thick with tension, as though the compartment itself understood that another explosion was imminent, even closer, even stronger, because trials never end with a single shock. And if the ship was to become battle-ready, it would have to endure blows no gentler than the first. The senior engineer, a tall man named Garrett, stood at the monitoring panel and, without turning, spoke in a hoarse voice that carried fatigue but no fear. "Everything's in the green zone, Alex, but this is only for now." Alexei nodded, though Garrett could not see, and approaching the central panel, he noticed a flickering vibration line on the screen, gradually leveling out, as if the ship, after the first blow, had exhaled deeply and was slowly bringing its heartbeat back to order. At that moment, the internal comms came alive again. Captain Reynolds' calm voice announced that the second explosion would occur in 24 minutes, and the tone revealed that, whatever he felt inside, he knew how to lock away emotions behind a steel shield, as is required of someone responsible not for instruments, but for human lives. Alexei felt a familiar weight rise in his chest, the same that comes before plunging into water, before a parachute jump, in moments when the body already knows the impact is coming, yet the mind must stay clear, because panic is a luxury no crew member can afford. Returning to the upper deck, to face the second explosion with the others, he noticed a shift in the atmosphere. People were quieter, yet in their eyes burned a terrifying resolve, the kind that comes to those who have survived one strike and understand they will endure the next. The sun hid behind the clouds, and the sea darkened, as if the ocean floor itself had risen closer to the surface to witness how its power would collide with the human-forged steel of the ship. In that moment, Alexei felt that the sea itself had become a participant in the trial, vast, silent, yet all-seeing. When the countdown rang out again through the ship, Alexei could not close his eyes. On the contrary, he stared at the horizon where the waves began to swell above the hidden underwater charge. And in that instant, when the second explosion thundered, he realized that now it was not only the ship being tested, but he himself, a man hearing for the first time how a colossal machine responds to the sea with its own heavy, confident breath.
The second explosion, though predictable in timing, felt entirely different. It did not merely strike the ship, it seemed to penetrate its very core, rolling along the hull in a deep, resonant vibration, so prolonged and low that it felt as though the ocean's depths were speaking to the metal in a language only steel could understand. And when that vibration slowly faded, every person on board, from senior officers to the youngest technicians, felt something shift within themselves, as if the blow had entered their very soul and, to many surprise, had not destroyed but rather strengthened something fragile that had been buried deep: confidence. Alexei stood, gripping the railing, trying to steady his still-shaken breath, which had been knocked off rhythm when the carrier's hull seemed, for a fleeting second, to sag downward, as though a massive steel slab had quivered under the blast's devastating force. Yet drawing on his inner resolve, it righted itself like a giant struck in the chest, slowly rising to show it still stood, and would stand, no matter what.
Around him, officers exchanged reports, precise, formal, clipped, but beneath the words lay a tension mingled with a kind of exhilaration, because every confirmation of normal readings became a small victory, a proof that this colossal machine, assembled by thousands of hands, truly could endure forces most people would never witness firsthand. Captain Reynolds personally came down to the deck, a rare gesture, as he normally remained on the bridge after explosions, overseeing the ship's overall condition. But now his presence signaled that this second strike had been exceptional, unusually strong, likely closer to the hull than anticipated. As he approached Alexei, his face was serious, but in his eyes shone something Alexei had not seen before, a quiet, heavy admiration. "Well?" the captain asked softly, as if afraid to break the vibrating silence that hung in the air. "How's the ship holding?" Alexei swallowed, nodded, and answered slowly, almost in a whisper, his voice still trembling from the experience. "It's holding. As if it knows itself that it must withstand this." The captain gave a faint smile, barely noticeable, more a glint in his eyes than a curve of his lips. "It does know, because we all make it understand." At that moment, the wind picked up, sweeping a cold gust across the deck, carrying the scent of salty foam and damp pine, so sharp it felt as though the sea itself were reminding them that the power here belonged to it, not to humans, no matter how immense their ship might be. The crew began preparing the systems for the third, final explosion, the most powerful and dangerous, set to detonate closest to the carrier, almost beneath its bow, so near that even the most experienced engineers hesitated to make premature predictions, for even a perfectly calculated structure could behave unpredictably when struck by forces from the deep, where the laws of nature and physics converge in a single point of pressure comparable to thousands of thunderclaps. Alexei watched the crew work, fast, coordinated, almost silently, as if the ship had become a vast organism in which everyone knew their role, and all actions combined into a single symphony of preparation, where not a single note was wasted, because even the smallest mistake in such a moment could be unbearably costly. And then, as he stood in the corridor between compartments, Alexei realized he was no longer afraid. Not because the danger had lessened. On the contrary, he fully understood that the third explosion would be the most destructive, the most merciless, the most difficult for both the ship and its crew. But fear had dissolved, transformed into something else, a firm confidence that comes once a trial has begun and there is no turning back. Either you endure or it breaks you. And it was this understanding that made every crew member a little stronger than they had been that morning, a little calmer than before the first strike, and far more prepared than before the second. When the captain announced that the third explosion would occur in 40 minutes, a heavy, dense silence swept across the ship, not frightening, not anxious, but deep and focused, like the breath taken before plunging into icy water, when the heart stops but the mind remains clear. Alexei lifted his gaze to the gray, seemingly endless sea, and felt that now they were not merely humans on a ship, but part of a vast, living duel between steel and the elements, a duel that would deliver an answer not only about how strong the carrier was, but also how strong they themselves had become.
Night fell over the ocean slowly and heavily, as if darkness itself hesitated to envelop the ship, preparing for its final trial, and so crept cautiously, gliding over the waves in soft shadows, dimming the last golden streaks of sunset, hiding behind the horizon. In this deepening darkness there was something ancient, unyielding, as if the sea were reclaiming the power briefly lost after the powerful explosions through which humans had tried to assert their right to traverse its surface, or was eager to swallow any metal. Alexei stood on the deck, watching the ship ready itself for the third and final strike, the strongest, most dangerous one, set to detonate closest to the Ford's hull, almost beneath its bow. Even the most unflappable engineers spoke quieter than usual, restraining the barely perceptible vibration of unease that arises only when one senses the thin line between the possible and the extreme. Short, clipped commands echoed across the ship.
not panicked, but brimming with absolute focus, the kind surgeons experience before the most complex operation, when every gesture must be precise, every word deliberate, and every person fully composed, because the fate of this vast mechanical organism rested in the hands of those who knew it best. Alexei descended once more to the lower decks, where the air was warm from the operating systems and thick with tension, almost tangible, as if it hung between cables and pipes and thin metallic threads, binding humans and machine into one living entity. The deeper he went into this steel labyrinth, the more he felt the ship's pulse, steady, heavy, yet confident, like the heart of a colossal beast that does not yield to the ocean's fury. Garrett met his gaze, a look full of understanding. Neither of them spoke aloud about the possibility that this explosion could be critical, but both knew it would reveal the true limit of strength. Garrett merely nodded briefly, returned his eyes to the monitors, and spoke in a low voice imbued with concentrated force. Everything's within limits. If it holds now, it will hold after. Alexei nodded, feeling the technician's words settle within him with a heavy but warming certainty, and turned to return to the deck, where he wanted to face the strike head-on, to witness the ocean's breath, to see the force with which the sea would rise over the charge, to watch the moment when two worlds, human and natural, collided in a single explosion. As he climbed back to the upper deck, the wind grew colder, sharper, as if the very air sensed it would soon be torn apart by the underwater blast, and the deck beneath his feet felt slightly more rigid than during the day, as though the metal, fatigued by previous shocks, was deciding for itself how to respond to the third. Captain Reynolds stood at the railing, gazing into the distance where the explosive team was already setting the charge, his silhouette against the dark sea as immovable as the ship's hull. Although Alexei could not hear his thoughts, he knew the captain held thousands of variables in mind: water pressure, distance, estimated vibration amplitude, potential damage, system response time. Yet remained calm, almost impenetrable, as if there were more steel in him than in the ship itself. When the internal comms announced the explosion in 2 minutes, a wave of silence swept the deck, so deep that even the wind paused for a moment. Into this quiet blended the booming heartbeat of the ocean itself, the heavy breathing of the waves, the distant roar of deep currents, the soft slap of water along the hull. All sounded like a prelude to the coming strike, as if the sea were warning that it would not hold back. Alexei fastened his safety harness, leaned against the cold railing, and lifted his gaze to the dark patch of ocean where the sky seemed lower than usual, where mist intertwined with the waves, concealing the spot where an incredible charge was hidden. 3, 2, 1, and in the next second, the world erupted. The explosion was not merely a roar, it was the growl of a massive beast unleashed from the abyss. A column of water rose so high and wide it seemed the ocean had turned itself inside out, and the sight stole Alexei's breath. The shock wave rolled over the ship like a hammer striking the rib of a giant stone slab, and the metal hummed as if crying out, taking a blow that would have shattered any weaker structure. The ship shuddered, leaned, vibrations rippling across every deck, every pipe, every person, as if the steel itself was testing not only its own strength, but that of those standing upon it. And in those long seconds, Alexei thought only one thing: hold, hold, hold. And the ship stood firm. Not merely endured, it answered the ocean with a matching, confident, steel-like breath. When the vibration subsided, silence fell so abruptly that it felt as though someone had switched off the world. And in that silence, Alexei realized the trial was complete, and with it, the invisible but ultimate threshold inside every person aboard had been crossed, the boundary between fear and strength.
The morning after the third explosion arrived quietly and gently, as if the ocean, having exhausted its fury, now sought to apologize to those who had endured its roar. The sea lay calm, a silvery sheet, upon which the clouds, once swirling over the towering column of water, were now softly reflected, and the whole world seemed renewed, as if the night had passed through not merely a shockwave, but some inner purification. Alexei stepped onto the deck before dawn, when the air was cold, crisp, and clear as glass, and stood silently, listening to the sounds of the ship, which was no longer merely a machine, no longer just a structure, but a living entity that had passed a trial endured by few living beings, for steel too has memory, weaknesses, and a proud ability to rise again after blows. Now the Ford sounded different, deeper, steadier, calmer, like a warrior who had survived the fight and now breathed slowly but with unwavering confidence. Crew members began appearing on deck, some with their usual morning vigor, others slower than usual, carrying the fatigue that comes not from physical exertion, but from tension straining the nerves when every moment could be the last quiet moment before a storm. Yet in their steps, their gazes, their gestures, there was something new, a heavy, mature, adult certainty, the kind that belongs to those who have looked into a force beyond human control and did not flinch. Captain Reynolds climbed to the bridge, but before entering, paused at the railing. For the first time during the trials, he allowed himself to linger, to look at the sea not as a testing ground, but as a vast, ancient force with which he had lived his whole life in a fragile alliance. Watching him from afar, Alexei realized that the captain had also passed a trial, perhaps the most difficult of his career, not a test of command, but a test of trust, entrusting the lives of hundreds and the fate of the ship to a single underwater pulse capable of bending steel. When the final diagnostic data came through, no critical damage, no losses, no system failures, there was silence at first, because those who had survived the strike that should have been the limit needed a moment of quiet to grasp the magnitude of what had occurred, to let the enormous, heavy wave of relief wash over them slowly and deeply, like a warm current flowing into cold water. Then, as if something within the ship clicked, changed tone, voices spread across the decks, not loud, not triumphant, but calm, mature, steady, carrying not a "we've won," but "we endured." And that endured was far more important than any victory. Alexei walked slowly along the deck, feeling as if he were stepping not on metal, but on living history etched into every millimeter of steel. Some trials change a ship on the outside, but others transform it from within, in places unreachable by tools, where the very essence of its construction resides. And now he felt it. The Ford was different, not just tested, but acknowledged by the elements, accepted by the ocean, which rarely recognizes human strength, and when it does so forever. The sun gradually climbed higher, dispersing the last remnants of morning gray, casting soft golden streaks across the ship, illuminating every scratch left by the night's shaking, every salt crystal clinging to the railings, every polished panel gleaming. It no longer looked like damage, but like marks of maturity, signs of growth, as if the ocean itself had signed the ship, recognizing that it had withstood its blows. Captain Reynolds finally stepped onto the open deck, walked along the line of officers, stopped at the railing, and spoke in a quiet but clear voice that seemed to carry across the entire sea. "Now we are ready." This "ready" did not signal the end of trials. In fact, it marked the beginning, the start of a new chapter, where the ship must not only endure blows, but live, move, receive aircraft, protect people, and be part of the vast, complex mechanism of the fleet. Yet now the crew knew, if the Ford survived the night, it would survive the years to come. Alexei looked at the steel contours of the ship, the radars, the decks, all the lines he had studied as an engineer, but now saw as a man who had poured a piece of his heart into them. A quiet, calm pride rose within him, not turbulent, not flashy, but deep and adult, the kind that comes only in moments of true, genuine strength. And when he looked out at the sea again, soft and calm, as if it had forgotten its nightly rage, he suddenly understood. The trials had not merely tested the ship. They had united the people. They had forged destiny. They had turned steel into home.